I'm making an indie stealth game inspired by Assassin's Creed and Dishonored, and a big part of its identity comes from the different lore. This isn't a game that's set in the real world. It's got different continents, different countries, different oceans, different history. Everything has been made up from scratch. This is a lie. And there's a few sci-fi elements that make it not completely grounded in reality. It's very much inspired by a clash of ideals and a clash of culture. One of the opposing factions, the Arodite Union, which I'll go into detail, is inspired by Mediterranean culture, by the Roman Empire, by the Spanish and by the Greek empires. And the other faction, the one that our main protagonist, Silas, will be fighting for, is very much inspired by a colonial West, a colonial America, a colonial South America, and the values and culture that they developed during the 1700s. This game is going to focus on the conflict of the two main continents. Arodite, which is composed of a series of independent states that have formed an Arodite Union. The inspiration is a bit obvious there. And then you have a colony in Premiere called New Aurelia. New Aurelia is where the game takes place. The game is going to take you across 4 different cities where Silas has to hunt down 4 different governors. This is an indie game that's somewhat early in development, but we already have a wishlist up, so if you want to support this project and believe in it, please do feel free to wishlist. The danger in this world comes from men, not monsters. I have a lot of respect and admiration for RPGs and games that include magic and monsters and creatures, but that's not the story that I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell a story about corrupt governors that abuse their power, about human assassins trying to lead a revolution. I wanted to focus on a gameplay loop and NPCs that are all mortal. Every single character that you're going to see in this game has a backstory, a life, an ambition, but they're all as vulnerable as Silas. And that's what I want to focus on, because my ideal and a favorite blend in fiction is when you take extraordinary circumstances and apply real life human stories. So if I create a fictional continent that has like some sci-fi elements like living metal, which we'll explore later on, it has fictional continents and a lot of things that wouldn't exist in the real world, and I inject humanity into it, for me it's incredibly appealing. Take for example The Last of Us. The Last of Us takes place in a zombie revolution, which is not a very finger crossed realistic situation, but the story focuses around the relationship between a father without a daughter and a little girl without a father figure, and their relationship over the course of 1.5 games. That's kind of the angle that I want to take with Outlaw's Vengeance. The stories, the conflicts, the betrayals, the alliances are all going to be with humans, by humans, and against humans, because for me it's just the most alluring and immersive way to tell an extraordinary story. So who are these humans that I'm injecting into the story, and where am I injecting them to? Arodite, or really the Arodite Union, which is the main faction you'll be going up against, is a collection of independent states that will be signified very strongly in the game by the color blue. And opposing that is the people from New Aurelia. This is the only existing colony in Premiere and the only place where people from Arodite have moved to live over the past few generations. Silas is someone who spent a lot of years in New Aurelia before the game takes place. It's a continent and a colony that's very sought after because it has a very rare and valuable metal called living metal. It's kind of like this sci-fi-esque ferrofluid. Ferrofluid is basically a metal that usually adopts a liquid form that allows you to improve technology and medicine at an exponential rate because of how the metal interacts and improves biological matter. But living metal is more than just a MacGuffin or some sort of other valuable resource that is wanted and is an allegory for oil, because even though it is allegorical and it does represent technological improvement and industrialization for its own sake, the living metal is a threat all unto itself. Arodite, Numera, and the Ophelan Islands are pretty regular continents when you compare them to the real world. They have their history, their wars, their battles, but the reason why it took so long for Premiere to be colonized is because the continent of Premiere is plagued by magnetic storms. Storms that create a magnetic reaction in the living metal that lives underneath, and whenever a storm rages, the living metal rises to the surface, spiking through in a violent way and causing damage anywhere it can be. So no one was able to create a settlement or a colony there, because anytime a storm would come, it would completely decimate anything that's been constructed. That's why for the longest time it was called the Untamed Continent, and there was a race by all the different countries and all the different continents to try and get there and mine that valuable resource, and the only way to do that was to develop the technology to be able to keep them at bay. This is what Arodite and the Arodite Union was able to do, and that's why they're the faction that you'll be fighting against. They were able to develop technology that only they have. They are called the cloud seeding drones. These drones are basically sent deep into the desert of Premiere to seed clouds, which is a real scientific term which essentially accelerates the formation of clouds and therefore the formation of precipitation and storms in order to trigger the magnetic storms deeper into the desert and keep the coast safe. And that's why over the past few generations, Premiere has gone from the untamed to the tamed continent. New Aurelia is the only colony there, and it's completely controlled by Arodite because no other continent was able to make it in time. It kind of sets the stage as to how powerful and how influential this opposing faction is and how Silas will have to deal with them. It doesn't mean that New Aurelians are all friendly with Silas. There's a lot of people in New Aurelia that want Silas dead for one reason or another. New Aurelia is an extremely oppressed colony. It's a colony that's known a lot of pain, a lot of control, and a lot of violence, not just from Arodite, but also from their own people. And this is what Silas is fighting to change. All of the provinces in the colony are ruled by tyrants, and some are more egregious and violent and and dark than others, but they're all equally as guilty in the eyes of Silas. So as you play through the game, you'll explore the different provinces. You'll see how the governors have impacted both the culture and the levels of danger of that world, and how Silas has to conduct investigations to know exactly what the weak points are of each governor and how to leverage the city and the architecture against them. Now, this is a lot of lore, and I'll keep talking about it for the rest of the video, but if you're interested in being updated more often about the lore, I write a weekly newsletter where I send you weekly lore entries that expands on the world of Outlaw's Vengeance. So those are the vibes to the podcast. So let's do a little bit of a deep dive into our thought process behind some of the world building we've done for Outlaws with our new red lights, courtesy of Sophie, both in terms of purchasing and in terms of setting up. I sat pretty and waited. You know what we should call it? Vengeance Red. We should trademark that red like Tiffany's. Tiffany's trademarked a shade of blue. We should trademark a shade of red. Vengeance Red.
Today we're talking about world building.
World building.
And lore.
And lore. Playing God, essentially. My favorite part of any creative project. One of the most common questions we're thinking we're going to get, just from when we talk about this with other people, is why did we choose to make Aruditas a continent and not a country? We could have just made it one country that kind of did the invading and the colonizing in New Aurelia. So why did we make it a continent?
So I think it's more original to organize it into a continent and then have to break down the political relations between all of the different countries in it, as opposed to having just one main country that's the main center of power.
Yeah, I agree, because one thing that I find really interesting in stories is when the, I guess, opposing faction or the antagonist of the story is clearly so much more powerful than the protagonist, and the reasons as to why they can't just steamroll through them are multifaceted or multi-layered. So for example, Aruditas, even though it has much more manpower than Silas will ever have, even though it has many more resources to pull from, there's so much political turmoil between those countries, there's so much resentment in between those countries and inability to cooperate, that there's a huge bottleneck in terms of how quickly and responsively Aruditas can be in reacting to a threat in their colony. And adding kind of layers like that as to why this obviously overpowered foe cannot just end a conflict in a day gives so much more intrigue to the strategy behind defeating someone who's much more powerful than you. They do this in stories like Dune, for example, where Paul Atreides threatens to blow up all the spice reserves to keep the houses at bay, even though Paul Atreides and the Fremen, by the end of the story, would be decimated by how many soldiers there are in the Imperium. None of them can really attack because Paul is holding the spice hostage. And that's something that made me want to push for a bigger force that is Aruditas as a continent, and see how the countries within Aruditas interact. Like Arcia is kind of like the lead, most powerful, most influential country, and it holds a lot of the political sway and the military sway, but it doesn't have the love and affection of all the other countries, and all the other countries have their own agendas, their own worries, their own crises at home. And this pledge to donate military troops to the Arodite Union, this pledge to donate their own money, is very clearly influenced by the European Union.
Yeah, I think it also allows us to explore war strategy and political strategy resembling the real world and current affairs, and I think that's just interesting to pull from. But my question is, although this does kind of like reflect on the European Union and a united continent, Arcia does emerge as the leader of the continent. So can you delve a bit more into that and how they achieve that position?
I'm so glad you asked. So I think I spoke about it like earlier in the video about how there's 4 main continents in this kind of like proto different alternate Earth. One of them is Aruditas, the other one is Premia. Those 2 are like the main continents that we're going to speak about, and they're going to be part of the story. And then you have Numera, which is kind of like adjacent to Aruditas, and then you have the Ophelin Islands, which are much more mysterious, kind of out of the picture when it comes to the overall conflict in the world. Just like in any epoch of human history, there was a lot of infighting, a lot of wars, a lot of territorial back and forth, and Aruditas was unlucky and lucky all at once, because during their wars, Aruditas was having a lot of like internal continental war between all their countries. A plague came in. The origin of it is contentious, and I think that I don't want to make it guaranteed in the writing, but there are a few theories of where the plague came from. But a plague came through and swept through all the countries while they were at war, and it's a huge plague and a huge change in the history of Outlaw's Vengeance. And the plague is called the Inward Plague because it basically ate itself inward from the neighboring outlying countries. During this plague, there were 2 countries that survived the most. 2 countries that happened to be the most militarily focused because they could take more extreme measures in how to handle a plague through quarantine and eradication of infected and things like that to kind of like handle the spread of the infection. One of the countries was called Lijos, and the other one was Arcia. Those were the 2 countries that were the strongest through the plague, the ones that resisted the best, and therefore by the end of the plague, the ones who were most likely to win the war. It was going to basically go to one or the other. Arcia, in that moment, created what would be known as the Noctari, which are a special kind of assassin that are trained specifically for political assassination. You can think of like sicarios in ancient Rome that were paid specifically to kill nobles and politicians, and that's kind of what Arcia developed to send to Ligios and kill the ruler and governor there. That's how the Noctari began, and that's how Arcia gained so much leverage when it came to brokering peace with all the countries who had been decimated by the plague. During the negotiations, Arcia was saying that they want peace. They were saying they want a union to unify resources, to unify military power, scientific knowledge, economic resources, but they were doing it with so much leverage that they could place stipulations that benefited them. For example, Arcia is the only country in the entire continent that is allowed to have Noctari. No one else is allowed to train them or have them.
But how can you possibly control that? Not letting other countries have their own, like, assassins.
First of all, they don't have the know-how of creating, training these people. Silas is an extremely highly trained assassin, not just like a regular assassin. He's not like other girls. I guess this is a very loose comparison, but there are many countries that have nuclear weapons, and they tell the other countries you can't have nuclear weapons.
But I think that is easier than controlling training of human beings.
Yeah, but I think that the lack of know-how on how to create them and the spies that will be in every single country, like gathering information, you can have a lot of flow information into Arcia and very little information flowing out.
Okay, then my follow-up question is going to be, how are the Noctari so fundamentally superior?
This is where you get into the world of fiction. I want Outlaw's Vengeance to feel grounded and be grounded, but at the same time there's a lot of things that happen that don't make a lot of scientific sense. Like, for example, the living metal is very pseudo-scientific, and therefore you can have some things that slightly suspend the laws of reality. If at least the laws of this universe are consistent, they don't all have to be realistic. So the Noctari, in a similar sense, train in a way that make them the top 0.1% of humans in terms of their physical ability, in terms of their intelligence and their ability to be an assassin. And this is something that all my favorite franchises have, like Warhammer in the way they train Space Marines, and Assassin's Creed in the way they train assassins. What I would make you think of is how there are certain countries like the US and the UK and Israel whose special forces perform vastly above every other special force. So if you look at the Navy SEALs, they're so much fucking more badass than like the Spanish ones, for example. And they're both human, but it's just the way they train, the process of preparation for it psychologically and physically, that make them a real threat compared to other countries. And that's kind of how you can think of the Noctari.
Yeah, I think that last bit you added grounded.
You weren't convinced until then. So that's why we decided to make Eruditus a continent. I am curious as to what you think of that decision. I was more inspired by blending in the Wild West, which is kind of like the 1700s, 1800s kind of style, and the things that were happening then, with a period in history that was taught to me and really marked me when I grew up in Spain, which was the Spanish Golden Age that started like in the early 1500s, late 1400s. And the Spanish colonialism throughout South America, a lot of the relationships and views that South Americans and Native Americans had towards Spain, and a lot of that influencing how New Aurelians see Arodite people. I remember that when I was first writing my first initial ideas for Eruditus and its relationship with Premia and their New Aurelian colony, you were taking a class in colonialism or something like that.
Spanish history studies?
By the way, if you don't know, Sophie's Argentinian and I'm Spanish. So there's a lot of history here between Sophie and me.
So one of the main things that I took as inspiration is something that I found was like ridiculous from my class, and it's what was called the Spanish Requisition. It was like a 1513 document that was written by the Spanish monarchy that basically claimed that Spain was divinely ordained to evangelize their colonies and the new land that they were discovering.
And also, just to interrupt you quickly, Spanish Requisition is not to be confused with Spanish Inquisition, which no one ever expects.
So it was basically a document that was read out loud, often to audiences that didn't understand the language, and that told them that they had to surrender because they were now under the rule of the Spanish monarchy.
As dictated by God.
Dictated by God.
A God that the people didn't believe in. And we thought that was so powerful for world building purposes alone.
Insane. It's just insane and arrogant.
Insane, yes.
So that leads us into wondering, how does religion play a role in this world, and whether Eruditus is trying to impose their religion onto the new continent.
Right, because if we're taking inspiration from, for example, the Spanish Empire, is the main motivation for Arodite expansion or Arodite control religion? And this is a question that I think is very important to answer in world building, even though these things don't show up that often in the game. Like, you're mostly going to be doing a lot of parkour, flips, and stabbing. I think this is what makes a world feel alive. I'm personally not religious, and I know that you're not as well, but I was raised Roman Catholic, so the religious culture still is very strong in me. And I'm often very motivated to write about and think about religion and humanity's relationship with God. That being said, in my formative years when I moved away from religion, I also was swayed by this whole thing of like science only and reason only and logic only, and saw how that often also becomes almost religious-like in how fervently people believe it and how fervently people judge others who don't believe in it. Like the arrogance with which rationalists judge people who believe in the horoscope or believe in religion or whatever is almost religion-like. It's basically saying, I don't allow you to believe in your own beliefs because mine is better and mine is right, which is the folly of all monotheistic religions. So what I really liked and fit with this kind of like resource pooling that Aruditas did when the Arodite Union was formed is to have a continent that is very much secular in its belief of God. They don't believe in any God. They don't believe there's a higher power, and they believe the only higher power you can appeal to is reason. That in itself has basically developed into its own kind of religion, even though it's not called that. And when we wrote the Edict of Sovereignty, which is basically this document that mimics the Spanish Requisition and the document they would read out, it basically speaks very similar to how you would speak about God, but rather with reason and enlightenment as the agents of the justification of your oppression.
Another of our philosophies, and this is what we're talking about this, is that we want to have the world as thoroughly developed as possible, even if not all of these details will be actually in the game, because I think that knowing this about the world that you're building allows you to represent it more faithfully, and then when you need to dive deeper and show more details, you have that lore in the back of your mind.
And I think there's also levels of world building that are useful for different reasons. There's like the, I suppose, diegetic, present, and obvious world building that you have within the game, which will be the dialogue and actions and things that Silas and other characters kind of address and interact with. Then you have the world building that is visible through the environmental storytelling and the way that the world is set up, which is useful for the players, but also for the environment artist. The more they know about that world and why a certain culture or architecture is present, why certain things are happening, you know, what buildings do what and why, it helps a lot. And then there's this kind of deeper world building of like the history of the history, or the politics of the politics, of the origin of the origin, that is in my opinion, just so fucking cool, but also makes every interaction feel natural, even if you don't see the origin of it. So ideally, when Silas says what he says, I won't have to do all this exposition, and most players won't know about this exposition, but Silas will feel like a real character because there's this real history behind it that even though it's not overtly spoken, it's felt because of how cohesively he behaves and all the other characters behave. I always love when worlds do that. Yeah.
So another thing that we thought of drawing from when it comes to history between Europe and Latin America is how Latin American colonies eventually regarded Europeans. There are a lot of Latin American authors, including Argentinian authors, that kind of like advocated for a European education for people in Latin America to learn English. And that was like obviously well regarded, but there's a flip side to that way of thinking, which is wanting your society to become Europeanized. And so I wanted to ask you, how is the relationship between New Aurelia and Aruditas after so much time?
Another thing that fiction does, especially very mainstream modern works, is always have the classic empire bad, colonized, hate the empire. There's no morally complex or interesting relationship between the colonized and the colonizer. And I get why. That doesn't mean that everyone who has been colonized has the same perspective on their colonizers. And that's something that's worth exploring, especially through a fictional means, because then there's no human being that's having that agenda. If I came on screen and said, I think being colonized is good, I'd be a tyrant and a dick. But if I display a society or write about a society where some of the thoughts and feelings are mixed in terms of how they view these colonizers, first of all, it's very realistic because it stems from a very real sentiment that a lot of Latin Americans have, and in my opinion, Argentina specifically still might have, about Eurocentric standards.
100%. Argentina is so Eurocentric, especially compared to other Latin American countries. So the relationship is definitely complex.
It's complex because Argentinians, for example, have a very proud sense of self and identity, and yet they very much want to feel and be seen as Europeans in relation to other Latin American countries, or at least that's the reputation.
Let's not even go into that.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, I think today, Crimea had a native society that existed as a nomadic tribe or a nomadic civilization. The reason why they were nomadic is because that was the only way to survive as a society with the magnetic storms. They had a means through which they could predict when a storm was coming. They would pack, ride their horses, and fuck off. Because the storms were coming, and they didn't have the technology that Aruditas has developed with cloud seeding to basically determine where the storms happen. So when these people were found and I guess colonized and eventually pushed out because the tribes aren't allowed within the actual territory of New Aurelia, which is the colony, a lot of them hated their colonizers and oftentimes responded violently, but many others welcomed them because it meant that they now finally had a way to not have to be nomadic, be able to settle down, expand, know peace, know safety, and know that storms won't come to them, because that's the guarantee that Aruditas gave, is basically saying fuck off off, don't bother us, and we'll make sure the storms don't go near you. Having some of that tribe grow old and teach their children to appreciate what they do, even though they're not even wanted in New Aurelia, they were so tired of running that they appreciated someone who came with the technology to keep them safe, I thought was very interesting. And then when children come from couples where one is Arodite and one is Premier Native, the relationship that child and its offspring will have with both cultures is also very interesting. One of the targets in the game does have that lineage. He's psychologically very much impacted by that. It impacts the way that you view Arodites, the way you view the living metal, and the way you view the nomadic tribes. All of this will just very much be in the background of the game that kind of frames the entire experience that Silas has. When we're talking about inspirations for the nomadic tribe being happy that these colonizers come, happy to be living in what others would think is a very oppressive state, which is basically not being allowed in certain parts of their own continent, and still being happy with that, comes from when I went to Vietnam, and the Vietnamese people are very okay with their very clearly, in my opinion, oppressive and communist government. The state of Vietnam is pretty bad in terms of like the quality of life, sanitary conditions, and the economic conditions. But because Vietnam is a country that has known so much war for so long, having a government that at least is keeping the peace is enough. The Vietnamese guy that was with us was basically saying a lot of Vietnamese people know that this is not ideal, that this is somewhat oppressive, that a communist regime is not the best. But everyone's so tired of war that anyone who can bring peace is welcome.
But ultimately, not everyone thinks in the same way. Not everyone has the same relationship to history.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes it more realistic.
100%. I think the only IP that I've seen do this well is Dune. When Paul becomes part of their society, there are some people who don't want him because they want their savior to be Fremen. And there's others that have been influenced much more by the Bene Gesserit kind of implantation of that idea that a outworlder is coming to save them, that are very open-armed about Paul. So the idea that there's a split in how they view their white savior, because it's obviously a white savior analogy.
Okay, that's true.
Interesting. That's basically, I want to say introductory, but we kind of went pretty deep. A lot of things. It's an introduction to the world of Outlaws Vengeance, the history of the continents that are involved, the kind of playground or environment that Silas is going to be running around and killing in, and the playground that if you wishlist, you will be running around and killing in. There is a video on screen which talks about the progress that we have made on the parkour and kind of like the initial steps we're making to build the parkour system. So if you want to watch that, click on it right now.